When fear arises, what do you do? Try and ignore what it's telling you or listen to what it has to say? And when life throws curveball after curveball, how can you stay true to what matters and retain your humanity, particularly in a world that seems more and more dominated by AI? I'm Sally Ann Airy, and welcome to Fearless Forward, the podcast that asks leaders how they've faced their fears. Today I'm in conversation with a learning and development professional who's channeling a lifetime of hard-won experience into a new project that not only aligns with his personal values, but also directly addresses the most pressing leadership question in today's digital frenzy: how to stay human despite AI automation. He addresses this in his book Lead with AI, Stay Human, but more on that in a moment. Following nearly 30 years working in various learning consultancies, Peter Whealy joined one of the Big Four in 2014. There, his work took him from London to San Francisco and then finally to Geneva, supporting clients with learning strategy, workforce transformation projects, and leadership development. Success brought promotion, and he became a partner in Switzerland, heading up the consultancy's learning, leadership, and talent management practice. He worked hard, inspired his teams, and consistently delivered results. Then last year, out of the blue, came a huge shock. An unexpected restructuring left him and many other partners without a job. At first, I thought I'd lost everything, he says. That moment forced him to pause and eventually reset professionally and personally. The outcome is Peter's new company, Elevate Potential, to help leaders and teams work optimally with AI while safeguarding what makes us human. His perspective on AI is that it should never be seen merely as an efficiency and cost-cutting tool, but as a means to create greater value by amplifying human talent. And his book offers a framework for leaders and organizations to elevate their potential. Our conversation focuses on the impact of the forced pause on Peter personally, the fears and opportunities that came with it, and the big realization that changed everything for him.
I was brought up in an incredibly strict Christian church, highly controlling to the point of it being almost too controlling, let me say. And in that environment, the only thing that was actually rewarded was following the rules, was working hard, having results, achieving, top grades in school, going to the best university, spending all of your spare time working. And I think in that context, there was no place for fear because, fear was ignored. You just worked hard, you moved quicker, you did more, you achieved more, and then you were accepted as a result. And I think that context in itself is important because that has defined me as a person and the rest of my life. And I think I've then, as I've grown older, had to look at some of the benefits that gave me, as well as some negatives that I've had to unlearn as I've gone through life. And to also then just to give you an example of, I've had three key pivotal moments in my life where each has been a major learning point for me. And the first was in 2008. I was on my motorbike going to work and somebody pulled out in front of me and I hit their car, was then knocked into a central bollard and then knocked again into an oncoming car from the other direction. Broke my neck, my pelvis, both my hips. I was out cold for who knows. The ambulance arrived, so it must have been 15, 20 minutes. And absolute terror. I couldn't feel my legs. I couldn't move. The most excruciating pain. And the paramedic just stroked my head and she just said, "You must have had a guardian angel on the back of your bike. Do not worry because you're alive. You're here. You're talking to me." And the most incredible, I guess, relief came as a result of, the words that she spoke to me. But, once I got to the hospital bed, all I could think about is I'm meant to have my next triathlon. I was big time into triathlons at the time. Didn't even know if I could walk again. I didn't know what was going to happen. And the way that my childhood had brought me up, and the way that I naturally would, react to situations, I overcame that fear by action, by trying to fix myself. So I set myself a goal to do an Ironman within 5 years. And that's what drove me. I was in a wheelchair for the best part of 6 months. I couldn't put full weight on both of my legs for nearly a year. And my wife, I had 2 kids at that point. She was incredible, helping me, supporting me. But I got through that by focus on the future. Fast forward, I guess, so I did the Ironman within 5 years, and I almost achieved the 12-hour mark that was my goal. And so that sort of taught me a reassurance of I was doing the right thing. And fear had no place, because I could always overcome everything myself.
Those words, "Don't worry, you're alive." In excruciating pain, lying on the tarmac. Unlucky to be alive by the sound of it, my goodness. So yes, she was right, don't worry, you're alive. And yet I'm imagining there was the most, well, as you alluded to, the most extraordinary fear. That everything that you'd lived for until that point was about to be taken away. And so the best you could do was to set your next goal. And in the middle of that story, and the truth, but, the narrative of that, in the middle of all of that, can you remember what you were afraid of?
I think fear of loss of my legs, loss of my ability to look after my family, loss of movement, of what defined me as being successful, which was, sport, action.
I can well imagine, Pete, because I think a lot of us can relate to that. And you set yourself this not average goal, Ironman, within 5 years. And you weren't even putting full weight on your legs, on your feet within a year. So that's extraordinary, isn't it? So may I ask, what drove you to set such an audacious goal at that point?
I'd always wanted to do an Ironman, but I knew there was a year of dedicated training for it. I think at this point I was doing maybe 5 or 6 triathlons a year. It was my absolute love. And so it was sort of the next goal. And I thought, just doing another triathlon is in itself is great. And yes, that's a nice target, but I wanted to set myself a stretch target. And I knew that, setting that stretch target would be something that would really motivate me, not to just get better, but to be the strongest I'd ever been, to be the fittest I'd ever been.
You were going to beat this thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you did 5 years on, did the Ironman. And you were about to tell us about a next important, pivotal moment in your life. What happened then?
Before I get to that, I just want to also reflect on the moment that I was lying in the hospital bed, and I guess maybe for the next sort of 3 or 4 months, because every smell smelt better. Every sound was more pure. I loved more deeply. I just valued life, just to be alive. And the danger was with recovery is that you soon forget that. And I think that is what happened to me. I if only I could have lived in that moment, I would have been truly happy or fulfilled, because it was just such a pure moment to live in. But as time went on, as I completed the Ironman, life itself happened once again. And, then moved countries. I moved from the UK to France, to the mountains, so that I could continue triathlons and exploring the outdoors. And at that point, I had 4 boys with my wife. We all moved out as a family. And then a few years later, without any indication, my wife went through an incredibly difficult moment in her life, which led to a breakdown and a very, very difficult, 1 to 2 years between us. And ultimately that led to us separating. And it was something outside of my control. But what I did was I read every single book I could about trauma. I tried to speak to every possible coach to better understand myself, to be a better human, to learn more and to react in different ways. But I was trying to fix. I was trying to always do more. And it was a situation that I couldn't fix. Nothing that I could do would change, that situation. And of course, once again, fear was a big part. Fear of loss, fear of what's going to happen, to my boys, a fear of losing my identity, because my identity had been my family. And, my friends called us the Incredibles because, we as a group could do anything. And that suddenly disappeared and I couldn't control it. And I think those two pivotal moments got me to this point when I lost my job. It was once again something I couldn't control despite trying. And I went into my default behaviors, which was to run faster, to fix. I went after every contact that I'd made over my 30 years of business, ran around on interviews. I was offered $1 million of funding to start a business. And some good friends of ours that as well, running a business called The Happy Startup, they invited me to a corporate retreat in the mountains. And I turned up on day one, only focused on how I was going to start my startup, the things that I needed to do, the action plans, the everything that I needed to get in order. Incredibly frustrated at the beginning of that first day, because it was pause. It was listen to yourself. Think about what the difference is between fulfillment and success. And an interesting exercise I did during that week was to really reconsider what fulfillment was. And I looked at 4 separate areas: time, money, health, well-being and relationships, and then purpose and legacy. And I think up until this point, I had money, but didn't have time. I had health and well-being, but relationships, of course, can take their hit when you're incredibly focused on your career. And purpose, to some extent, I felt fulfilled because I was doing something I loved. And legacy, of course, yes, that was important. I think I had left legacy with the people I'd worked with, but I didn't truly feel fulfilled. And I think that week allowed me to step back from my natural behaviors of keeping, running. And at that point, I made the ultimate decision to start my business, which I've called Elevate Potential, because Elevate Potential is really linked to my purpose. It's helping myself and others become better versions of themselves.
It feels to me as if a central, terribly important thing that happened to you in your life actually was when you were lying on that hospital bed. What I heard when you shared that with us a little earlier in this conversation was that you let go, allowed yourself to experience what was present through your senses. I think you said something like everything smelt more intensely. Hospitals don't always smell, not the nicest smell in the world, right? But you were smelling them intensely just as they were. You were loving more deeply. You said something like, or I heard you say something like, if I could have just stayed like that, and then life took over. So perhaps the hardest thing is to be fully present. And what I'm hearing from that week, altitude, beautiful week in the mountains that Carlos and Lawrence co-create for a group of founders and leaders who come together. That week gave you the space to almost, not exactly, but find again that sense of being present with what really matters. So from that place of what really matters, you're building your business. And what I'm hearing, what really matters to you is that you support people, leaders, to understand and connect with their potential. This word that we all use, fulfill your potential. Tricky one. How do we know? But I'm guessing that's what really matters to you, is to help human beings to do that.
That's absolutely right, Sally-Ann. And I think when I reflect on, the moment I was told that I was being restructured, to the impact that this had on the team, and they then invited me to a farewell. And one of the books I'd always talk to them about is called The Big Five for Life. And what they did was they actually recreated part of this book, which was called The Museum Day. And every person that had been part of my team or had been impacted by me, they reflected on the impact that I had had on them as a leader, from the interview through to crazy text messages or team events that we'd run. And I stood in that room walking around the museum in tears, because I'd been so caught up in the moment of running forwards, doing more, achieving more, always needing to help clients more, help the team more, and hit bigger targets, as is the necessity in consulting. That in that moment, I could stand back from all of that and actually see how individual lives had been impacted, and hadn't necessarily taken stock of that at the time. And that moment walking around that room was incredibly powerful for me. And I think actually helped to reassure me that starting my own business was the right thing, to align with my purpose, and to make sure that I could, build that purpose into the people that I work with. And what I then did was I made the decision to write a book. And that is intrinsically linked to my purpose as well, for two reasons. One is I do believe that everyone can improve themselves. They can change their mindset and behaviors. It's never a simple thing, but it is something that is absolutely possible, as I have actually had to do, particularly through my divorce, to really challenge myself and to think how I can be a better human, a better father, a better person in relationships. And how can I then do that in business to help others? And the other side was a trend that I'd been watching to some extent with horror, with AI, where companies are automating for efficiency, for cost cutting. We're seeing huge numbers of individuals, losing their roles because AI is automating their tasks and processes, and swathes of certain functions are disappearing, and emails being used, words in emails being used, such as elimination of your role. Absolutely nothing about humanity and the importance of people. So I'm combining those two to prioritize people, to put people first as we use AI to help ourselves become better, to become faster, become more effective. But it's through a people first approach to AI that I'm particularly passionate about. And that book, I've spent the last 5 months writing that book, and it's called Lead with AI, Stay Human. And in that book, I've created a framework called SPAR. So strengthen, partner, amplify, and reshape. And it has to start with the strengthen, which is my identity. How do I, as a leader, need to strengthen my leadership skills, the way that I interact, the things that make me uniquely human, like judgment, empathy, curiosity, my vision, my integrity. They are innately human that AI will never replace. And I think we need to dial those up as leaders, particularly when AI is speeding everything up, giving us more data, more confusion, and the necessity for us to pause and to take a step back and to listen to what I call our guidance center, so our heart. How do we use that to direct us, to listen to our gut, and then apply our action center, our head? And I think, part of me telling the stories that I have done is because I think I'd over dialed my action center, and underutilized my guidance in many points. Now, my integrity and some of those core values are incredibly important to me, but I saw my value through action, through doing. And that then led to new roles, new promotions, greater responsibility. But actually in that, I think I lost some of the things that really matter.
Yes. And the idea that success is just about achievement, which, is fair enough. You, in any sense, the word have been successful, certainly, but not fulfilled, as you said. So the idea that in order to attain some sense of fulfillment, we have to connect not just with our thinking brain, but with our emotional center, our heart, with our instinct, our gut. We have to learn how to listen to those things, to take a more holistic approach, I suppose, to decision making.
Yes, it's about not only using one of those areas, but all three. And well, actually, Sally Ann, I mean, you were out on that retreat, and your voice still rings true with me. Laughing at me for going, oh my goodness, this guy is just wanting to run. Just, Peter, just pause, take some time to reflect and listen to all three areas. Absolutely.
And so in doing that, and using all of the experience, your lived experience, the things that you've so graciously shared with us, how do you see your next steps?
I think it's spending my time on the things that I feel can have greatest impact on the people I work with, that is also aligned to my personal purpose. I had a really interesting conversation with a CHRO yesterday, and he was saying to me that similarly, his last 5 months have been the most impactful and purposeful to his life because he surrounded himself with the right people. He has been working on work that is making a huge impact on the individuals and not just making more money or restructuring to reduce costs, but actually aligning his personal purpose with the activities that he's doing. So for me, it's absolutely exactly the same. It is that alignment of spending the time that I think can have the greatest impact, and particularly with AI at the moment, where I'm seeing lots of decisions being taken that aren't necessarily right for individuals, or aren't right for teams, aren't actually right for companies, and certainly not right for society.
Because you have, as you mentioned earlier, nearly 30 years of experience in learning and development. So when you think about, you cast your mind back over those years, what did you learn about people?
The people are hard to change unless they want to change. And I include myself in that. And I think I would love to say take the example of my marriage. I'd love to say I was the perfect husband. Of course, probably not. But using that learning experience to challenge myself, to think through how I can be better and understand other people more, and to understand how I might come across. And I think until an individual wants to change, of course, they're never going to change. And I think I see the same thing in corporate. I spent 4 years of my life on a huge transformation for a pharmaceutical company, over $1 billion spent on this transformation, and huge amounts of wasted time, effort, and money trying to force people to change when they don't actually understand the why. And I think for me that is the biggest learning point from a lot of these transformations that I've supported. We have to communicate to individuals why this is important and help them see beyond the fear. So again, take AI as an example. At the moment, a lot of people are seeing AI as an evil that will remove or help them, where they will lose their job. So if I support this AI transformation, it's going to automate the tasks that I'm doing. Therefore, I'm going to hold on as long as I can and maybe not support this initiative. And I think the opposite needs to be true. We as leaders need to show them the future, that it is going to be better. And yes, their particular role might disappear, but that doesn't mean that their role can't evolve into something more impactful. And that's the evolution I feel that we need to help guide people through, is that, tasks can change, roles can change, but people need to continually evolve, and we need to explain the why for that evolution.
And I suppose to spend the time, and it takes time, but to spend the valuable time listening to those fears, listening for what people need, at least listening, at least giving them the space to be heard, right? My experience is that when we do that, people are more inclined to listen back because then their need is being met. But it does take time, doesn't it? If you say to, I don't know, CHRO, CEO, any sort of C-suite board member, that you're going to have to spend a few weeks just listening to what people need. Yeah, it's a tricky one, but it's so important.
Absolutely. And one of the chapters I've written in this book is around the personal identity crisis that a leader needs to go through.
Mm.
And that identity change is from being the one with all the knowledge, the one who has the best answers, the one who can deliver the most, and to tell their team what to do, to a future state where it's about asking the better questions. How do you help the team to find the right questions, that they become self-sufficient, to think through, okay, knowledge now, perhaps through AI, is becoming more disseminated. Anybody can become an expert at any topic that they prompt into an AI platform. So how does that leadership role change as a result of that? And it is about truly being the leader, of helping the team fulfill their purpose, not just me leading them and guiding them and telling them what to do. And I think that's a really critical transition that we've always known leaders should do. And that just becomes more exponentially important as we're seeing AI transition and speed up a lot of the feeling that decision making needs to happen quicker.
Yes, and so it takes courage, doesn't it, for a leader to pause, slow that down, and ask the right questions. And in your book, you have examples, don't you? We should just disclose here, I've read the draft of your book, so I happen to know this. But you have examples of people who are doing this in practice.
One of the people I interviewed in the book was Amy Edmondson, who's written The Fearless Organization. And she talks a lot about psychological safety and the importance of allowing people to speak up and the danger of silence. And I think that is also something that's really important for me when I watch failures happen, where leaders say, okay, nobody's got anything to say about that. Okay, decision made, let's move on. And the consequence with that type of action or that type of perspective or that leadership is that the failure isn't seen for 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. The organization I talked about earlier, they had a 600 million write-off on their balance sheet as a result of poor decision-making at the early stages. And my argument is that by taking a step back, by giving space for better questions, for hearing different individuals' perspectives, and for really challenging ourselves as to whether this is the right decision, that gives the space and the time to make sure that we are making better decisions that have a higher probability of success, despite changes that might come and impact those decisions, in the future months. But we have to make the best decisions we can at the time. And I think they're some of the stories that we share in the book from an individual perspective and an organizational perspective, where taking the time with the team and the various functions in an organization where those decisions will impact the different teams, to really listen before hitting the go button, and to make sure that we've really challenged ourselves to think the likely scenarios through.
Yes, have we asked all the right questions? And if we haven't, and if we know we haven't, there's going to be a problem downstream. And you just know it when you are blind or avoid the difficult questions at the time of making the decision. It's so important to do that. And also, you've interviewed one or two leaders, haven't you, who are doing this in practice? There's one that comes to mind that I was particularly impressed by. I think in chapter 3 of your book. I wonder if would you care to describe that as well?
Exactly. So this is a chief executive of an investment management business whose role is to help the investment management firm make good decisions, buying and selling organizations to, of course, to make better margins, make higher revenues, and to grow. And was faced with a decision with one of his companies where automation looked like the absolute best option. And to step back from that initial indication that cost savings and efficiency could be brought into the business by AI, and to really question the value of the organization. And what he very quickly saw was that value was human connection. It was relationship business. And by automating would move to a commoditized product and would lose the value that the employees brought for the relationships and for the long-term success of the business. And he had to step back and to really listen to his gut about what the right decision would be, and ultimately made a decision to augment, to automate the particular processes and tasks that didn't add significant value to the clients, but to retain the critical human interactions, the critical decision makings that only humans could make, and retain that core important angle and perspective of the business. So yeah, that interview and amongst many others have been fascinating for me, and I think has really brought life to the book from real life scenarios and stories. And I hope that's ultimately what people who will come to read it will be able to gather. Despite the industry that they might be working in, despite the role that they might have, there are so many lessons that we, I think, can draw from hearing other people's stories and perspectives. And some of those have been wrong decisions, and learning from those errors, as well as making good decisions and seeing the consequences. The very last chapter, I'm drawing on stories of two organizations who are making very difficult decisions to reimagine their operating model, reimagine their business, and to create a shared ownership and to reimagine the customer journeys. That's a fundamental change to the organization. And therefore, it's a fundamental change to the leaders leading those organizations. And that's, I think, is the challenge for all of us, is to adapt and evolve rather than say, this is what I've done for 30 years, so let's keep doing it.
Quite, because that's not going to work. So here we are in this time of exceptional, we always say this, don't we? But I think it's fair to say exceptional change. A whole new world is emerging as we speak, trying to make sense of it, trying to keep pace, trying to adapt, trying to stay human, trying to elevate our potential. It's a big ask, isn't it? So when you step back and look at all of that, and you've been thinking about this practically non-stop now for 5 months, Peter, what do you think is the biggest challenge for leaders at the moment?
I think it really is breaking with their default, breaking with the belief that what has got me here will get me there. It's not the case, because what got you here, as in my personal story, was a particular set of behaviors which I've realized, yes, were incredibly valuable. But actually, it got me to a particular peak, mountain peak, which, yes, had a great view, but actually there was a different peak with a better view, which was fulfillment rather than a job title or a particular role or a particular bank balance. And I think the challenge to all leaders is to really think through, why am I doing what am I doing? What are the right elements to the way that I'm leading that I need to retain, and what do I need to adapt? What I've done in the book is I've looked at some of the core leadership principles that are universal, that won't change, and then try to say, okay, let's say judgment or empathy, they are going to be uniquely human and they are going to be universal. But in a time of disruption, of change, of increased speed and uncertainty, what do they mean to us as leaders? So judgment for me becomes judgment under ambiguity. Empathy, still critical, and how does that evolve into being a trust steward? Curiosity, again, critically important. And how does that transition into adaptive leadership? And then the vision and integrity I've combined into what I'm calling enterprise orchestration. And by enterprise orchestration, I mean, rather than just doing what I think is important for me in my function or in my role, to make decisions that bring enterprise value. How do I orchestrate the business regardless of whether it's my responsibility? How do I help us make better decisions? And I think that's the transition that I'm hoping to help leaders navigate, which is to dial up those universal truths and to then use them in a slightly different environment than perhaps what we worked in 5 or 10 years ago.
And in all of this, because these are rational, much needed shifts, perhaps of consciousness, even of awareness, certainly. And in the middle of all of this is the leader, in amongst many leaders, probably, certainly in a large organization, but the one. And perhaps their greatest challenge is holding themselves through all this, right? Because they're not robots. They're human beings too. Holding a lot, and how you support them, how we support them in our work to do that well.
And I think that's the underlying principle of the book, which is don't act out of fear, because fear will have rapid decisions. It will act out of maybe a myopic perspective, not listening to other voices. It's reactive. It's perhaps not, decisions not taken for the best reasons and rationale. And what actually needs to happen is to transition that fear into one of hope and purpose. And actually, yes, my job might disappear, but there's a greater potential for me. And actually, half of the job I was doing was boring, it was mundane, was process based. So my future, if I own my own growth, I own my potential, and I learn, I challenge myself, I put myself into uncomfortable positions, that fear turns into hope. And the same thing for AI. Rather than being led by fear that this transformation or AI implementation is going to remove my job, to say it's going to remove parts that I don't like. Or yes, the role I was doing wasn't enjoyable, but actually I've got a greater potential.
So here you are now, at this point in your life, in this point of your work. When you look forward, what does fearless forward mean to you personally?
Well, I tell you, it definitely doesn't mean eliminating fear. That's something I've done my whole life, and I think it's really listening to the fear, but knowing that there is a reward by listening, and that reward is clarity and honesty with yourself. I think it's growth by putting yourself in uncomfortable positions. Everyone talks about, being out of your comfort zone. I think when you are out of your comfort zone, fear exists naturally because it's something you've not done, something you're not necessarily comfortable with. But when you do that, I think it's your path towards fulfillment. So I think it's fearless forward for me is more about not letting fear inform, but really to help define your future. I think I've personally learned to give it space, to listen to it rather than just covering it up, but also to share those fears and uncertainties with others and not see that as a weakness. That vulnerability is actually strength. And I think from that position, we can then start making decisions with clarity rather than panic. And yeah, as a father, even, I think, as I've mentioned, I've got 4 boys. I want them to see my legacy of courage and elevating my own potential and the potential of others. And that's what I'd like them to have. So I think that can be applied to ourselves, to our roles, to our companies, to embrace the uncertainty and not act out of fear, but out of courage.
When you've spent a lifetime responding to fear by moving faster, working harder, taking control, perhaps the most courageous thing you can do is simply to stop. And what Peter discovered in that pause is that growth doesn't always come from doing more, it comes from doing differently, from listening, reflecting, letting go of what is no longer serving you. Peter's insight that the things that got us here may not get us to where we want to go next is not new, but it is critical, especially now when AI is causing many of us to reevaluate our value and purpose and our identity as leaders. Because we can't lead others unless we're willing to evolve ourselves. And perhaps the most important moment in Peter's journey was not the Iron Man or the partner title, but lying in the hospital bed with horrendous injuries when he simply allowed himself to feel fully alive and to accept what was happening. Fear isn't something you can outrun. Better to pause, listen, and ask yourself, what really matters here? And what do I need to let go of to move meaningfully forward? Thank you for listening. Fearless Forward is edited and produced by Mark Steadman. I'll be back with you in 2 weeks for our next conversation about how leaders have faced their fears. To be sure of catching it, go to fearlessforward.org or subscribe to my weekly bulletin at skillfulleaders.com.